Hello, according to Standing Order 108.3F, and the motion passed on April 25th, 2022, we are continuing our study of importance of official languages at Canadian National. Welcome to our witnesses, and a warm welcome to the Minister of Transport, Honourable Omar Alghabra.
Transport, Serge Bijimine, Assistant Deputy Minister, Policy, Tamara Rouge, General Director, Surface Transportation Policy, and Colin Stacey, General Director, Air Policy. Minister, you will be given a maximum, as you know, of 5 minutes for your remarks, after which we will proceed to a round of questions. Je vais vous indiquer, Monsieur le Ministre, quand il vous restera 1 minute, puis 15 secondes.
I'll indicate when you have 1 minute left.
Monsieur le Ministre.
Mr. Minister, you have 5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Inviting me to meet with the committee today. Merci pour l'invitation, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for inviting me to meet with the committee today. It's my first in-person committee meeting, so it's a privilege for me to be with you.
As the Mr. Chair has mentioned, by following representatives from Transport Canada, Serge Bijimine, Assistant Deputy Minister, Policy for Transport Canada, Tamara Rouge, Director General, Surface Transportation Policy, and Colin Stacey, Director General, Air Policy. Mr. Chair, our official languages are at the heart of our country. Nos langues officielles sont au cœur de
Our official languages are at the heart of our national identity, and French is at the heart of the Quebec nation.
To be here today to speak about our government's commitment to protecting both official languages in the federally regulated transportation sector. We believe that all Canadians deserve to be served in the official language of their choice by federally regulated businesses. In addition, we agree that employees of federally regulated private sector companies like CN Rail have a right to work in French. Les Québécois doivent pouvoir travailler.
Quebecers should be able to work in French in Quebec.
Former Crown Corporation, CN's services are subject to the Official Languages Act. For all these reasons, we agree that the lack of Francophone directors on CN Rail's board is unacceptable. Le manque de francophones ou
The lack of Francophone directors on CN Rail's board is completely unacceptable.
With CN Rail and made it clear that we expect them to correct this lapse as soon as possible. Monsieur le Président, on a parlé.
Mr. Chair, we've spoken with CN and made it clear that we expect them to correct this lapse as soon as possible.
CN has agreed to address the situation during the next round of board appointments this year and has already begun searching for a Francophone Quebec-based board member. In addition, we are working on modernizing the Official Languages Act to ensure it reflects the current situation in Canada and promotes real equality between English and French. La CN a accepté de régler la situation.
CN has agreed to address the situation. They've already begun searching for a Francophone Quebec-based board member.
En égalité.
We need true equality between English and French.
We're proposing changes to several provisions relating to private enterprises under the federal jurisdiction in Quebec and other regions with a strong Francophone presence. These changes would strengthen official language rights by making sure private companies in those regions provide French language services to consumers, respect the language rights of their employees, and promote the use of French in their workplace. Le projet de loi va renforcer la France.
This bill will reinforce French and true equality between both official languages.
These proposed changes would give the Official Language Commissioner new enforcement tools including the ability to impose financial penalties. La commissaire aux langues officielles va...
The Official Languages Commissioner will have new enforcement powers.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Les entreprises comme la CN devraient refléter...
Businesses such as CN should reflect the values of our society.
Introduced changes to modernize and strengthen the Official Language Act. C'est pourquoi nous avons pris...
That's also why we have introduced changes to the Official Languages Act to make sure that CN respects official languages rights of customers and employees. On a personal note, I was born and I grew up outside of Canada. I have not had the opportunity to learn French while I was growing up. But as an immigrant, I respect the way that French is part of the Canadian identity. This reminds us of our diversity and our cultural richness. As an immigrant, I think that I can continue to play a role in order to help new Canadians to understand the importance of French and to defend linguistic rights of Francophone Canadians. Thank you.
To continue with the different questions that will come out of this committee. So, nous allons commencer la première ronde de questions avec...
Let's begin. First Vice President of the committee, Mr. Godin, you have the floor for 5 minutes. 6 minutes. Sorry, 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Mr. Minister, thank you.
In French. It's a same problem for me in English. Merci beaucoup. Monsieur le Ministre,
Thank you so much. Mr. Minister, the motion that was tabled by the NDP was following to news that came out concerning the absence on the board, on the CN's board, of any Francophones. You know, and here at the committee, we ask questions of the CEO of Air Canada. Now it's CN, and there are probably other federal institutions that do not show any interest or attention to the French language. Mr. Minister, I would like to have a very brief answer to this. How can you impose to federal businesses or federal institutions that members of the board, that they rather be a Francophone component to the board?
Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Godin, for the question. And let me just say thank you for indulging and giving me a little bit more time as I am working through French. I am doing my best to learn French as quickly as possible. Monsieur Godin, I think those are important questions to be posed to former Crown corporations who are subjected to the Official Languages Act. I think it is really important that CN and other, like Air Canada, set leadership example. Of course, they have a responsibility to meet their obligation under the Official Languages Act, but even on things that maybe where the Act was silent, they have a responsibility to demonstrate leadership. And I think it's unacceptable that the Board of Directors does not have a Francophone representative on it.
je suis d'accord avec vous, Monsieur le Ministre.
I agree with you, Mr. Minister. And I think that the first problem is that the federal government is not preaching by example when the unilingual Anglophone also spoke an Indigenous language. This nomination for the Governor General, we don't have an English and French-speaking Governor General for the country. So, Mr. Minister, were you consulted when the Official Languages Modernization Act was drafted? Were you consulted as a minister?
Mr. Godin, and I supported strengthening our Official Languages Act, including the new idea of giving the Commissioner new tools to impose fines when a corporation that is expected to meet its obligation fails to do so.
En fait, Monsieur le ministre, vous avez
Mr. Minister, you're totally correct. I was surprised by C13, but in C13 there is no tool, no means on behalf of a minister, or a prime minister, or a government to impose nominations to the board with a proportion of francophones in different federal institutions in Canada. I understand that you're relying on good faith, but in the past 45 years, Air Canada has not tried to integrate on its board, more francophones. And what happens, Mr. Minister, is that there's no trickle-down effect into the machine. So there are a lot of problems internally. But earlier on, you spoke about a leadership. And so you're relying on the good faith of these managers. Is that not a mistake on behalf of the government? Because the past shows us lessons.
What we are really focused on and interested in is outcomes. We want to make sure that customers receive services in the language of their choice, either English or French, or that employees are protected so they can work of the language of their choice. Now, I look forward to the committee's study of C13 whenever, and I'd like to see it get here as quickly as possible. And I'm confident that you are going to study all components of it and offer your own recommendations. But we're really determined in making sure that customers and employees' rights are protected to get served in the language of their choice.
Monsieur le ministre, est-ce que vous serez
Mr. Minister, would you be comfortable in proposing yourself as Minister of Transport, and given that you're concerned about equity and equality between both languages, an obligation in the Act to force the boards to have Francophone representation, a term of percentage. Some people said 25%, others said maybe more or less, depending on the regions. So this is the question. Would you be comfortable, you as a minister, to have this tool in order to impose?
Good. I know, we know that both of these organizations, we're talking about CN and Air Canada, are private companies. Having said that, I'm really interested in protecting the rights of customers and employees in ensuring that they get the language of their choice. Having said that, I don't want to preempt the study of your committee. So I know you're going to study it thoroughly, and I want to take a moment to encourage all members of the House to pass second reading of C13 so it gets to this committee so you're able to conduct full study for it.
Merci, Monsieur le ministre.
Thanks, merci, Monsieur le ministre. Merci, Monsieur Godin.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Thank you, Mr. Godin. That's 6 minutes.
Mr. Iacono. Mr. Iacono, 6 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Et,
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Minister. And thank you to all your staff as well. I have to say that your French has improved a lot since you've been following French classes, and also your numerous visits to Quebec have helped. So congratulations for your huge improvement in trying to learn the French language. In your opening statements, you give us a lot of hope, and you seem to indicate that the situation will be rectified. Mr. Minister, how do you understand the obligations of CN as a business subject to the Official Languages Act?
Thank you very much, Mr. Yannico, for your kind remarks. I still have a long way to go work on my French, but I'm grateful for your support and kind support. CN was commercialized in 1995. And just like Air Canada, that was commercialized in 1988. One of the conditions of that commercialization is that it upholds its obligation under the Official Language Act. So there's an obligation, there's a legal obligation on CN to ensure that their customers and their employees' right to be served or work in the language of their choice is protected. So CN has that obligation enshrined in law.
merci, Monsieur le Ministre.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Does the same question apply to Air Canada?
Parce que Air Canada, c'est
Air Canada is also, well, it's a private business. It's a type of a crown business. Subject to the same requirements?
Let me pause here and explain why. Air Canada and CN are both private corporations, indeed. But there were former Crown corporations that the public, Canadian public, had invested in the past significant amount of investment, and part of the commercialization deal was to ensure that they maintain that respect of Canada's identity and respect for official languages. So yes, both organizations have those obligations.
merci. Plus généralement,
Thank you. More generally, as a minister, do you have a word to say on the composition of the CN Board of Directors? That is to say that there should be a Francophone representation on their board.
Yes, and I believe that CN understood that after the announcement of the new board members that occurred. They understood that this should not have happened, and that they're working very hard on ensuring the adequate representation in their next round of appointments. And what we shared with CN is that, again, even the law might be silent on the makeup of the board of directors, but CN has an obligation to Canada, to Canadians, to set a leadership example to ensure that there's adequate representation on the board of directors.
est-ce que Transport Canada
Does Transport Canada have the power to impose penalties if regulated companies like CN are not respecting the Official Languages Act?
Transport Canada does not have the authority to enforce the Official Languages Act. However, we work closely with the Official Languages Commissioner on whatever assistance they need and support, and we regularly remind CN and and Air Canada of their obligation towards upholding the Official Languages Act. But the power is vested within the Official Languages Commissioner, and this bill that's coming to you soon, Mr. Yannico, has now new authority for the Commissioner to impose fines.
Est-ce que vous savez
Would you agree that Transport Canada would you agree that they should have such powers to impose penalties?
Again, I'm looking forward to the study of the committee when Bill C-13 arrives here. The idea here is to ensure that the Official Languages Commissioner, who has the expertise, the knowledge, and the authorities to ensure that he or she is able to investigate and uphold the Official Languages Act responsibility.
Juste pour l'avoir on the record, on va dire.
Just to have it on the record, in your opinion, should official languages be a part of representation and inclusion efforts made by CN?
As I stated, one legal obligation is one thing, setting an example and creating an environment of leadership and inclusivity is another. And I think CN needs to be aware of that responsibility that they have towards their employees and customers.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Minister.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Monsieur
Thank you, Mr. Iacono. The following questions will come from the second Vice Chair of the Official Languages Committee. Mr. Beaulieu, you have the floor for 6 minutes. Hello, Mr. Alghabra. Congratulations. Your French has greatly improved. We see that you have a good teacher, perhaps even better than Mr. Rousseau's teacher. Of course, it's difficult to ad-lib like this, but when we try, we get used to it. I'm not criticizing your competence at all, but when you were named by Prime Minister Trudeau, does the fact that you don't speak French send a message? We talked about the Governor General and other cases. This is a frequent it's a frequent thing that happens. Do you think that sends a message? Is that similar to what's happening at CN? Thank you, Mr. Beaulieu.
And kind comments. Look, I think it's really, first of all, not every Canadian is able to speak both languages. And what we need to do is support and help every Canadian see the importance of French. Mm-hmm. There are many Canadians who either, like me, didn't grow up here, never had the opportunity to learn French growing up, or for one reason or another, didn't learn French. And I feel my responsibility is, as someone who's like them, to remind everyone of the importance of French in Canada, the importance of Quebec to Canada, and the fact that Quebec is a unique nation within Canada, and we need to work with everyone. Yes, ideally, everyone in Canada should speak French. But given that we have a significant segment of our society who do not, I feel I have a responsibility to set an example that I'm putting in effort to learn French, and even those who don't learn French to respect French and understand why it's important that those who speak French receive services in their workplace or from their provider or supplier to speak with them in French.
Mm-hmm. Merci.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that Quebec is a distinct nation. Do you agree that Quebec has as its only official language French?
Est une nation qui a
that it's a nation that has as an only official language French.
Over the years in my political involvement, never to speak on behalf of Quebec. I let Quebecers speak on behalf of Quebecers. I am here to defend their rights.
Sans vouloir...
Without wanting to interrupt you, but we did table a motion not long ago. The governor of Quebec wanted to enshrine in its own constitution that Quebec is a nation that has French as its only common and official language. I didn't notice if you voted for this motion or not, but many members voted in favor of it. Would you agree?
I could tell you that in 2006, my first time when I was a member in the House of Commons, and at that time in opposition, when the idea of Quebec as a nation came to the House of Commons, and at that time it was seen by some as a controversial notion. I was proud to stand in support of that motion. So, as I said, I totally understand, maybe not fully, but try my best to understand the unique identity of Quebec as a nation, and if its protection of its culture, if its language, and I will do whatever I can to promote Quebec's culture and language.
Parfait, parce que dans le fond,
because it's not just the matter of Quebec, it's about self-determination, whether it be Palestine, Catalonia, or others. We saw that within the federal government, there are some challenges. A study showed that 40% of Francophones are uncomfortable speaking French within government departments. Even in Quebec, the vice president of the Public Service Union said that English was always dominating, even in Quebec. In your department...
surtout en français.
Un instant.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. One moment, please. I'm trying to understand. As much as I love my colleagues' questions, we have the minister here to answer questions about CN and not about public service in general. So I'm trying to understand the connection with the motion that was adopted unanimously by the committee. What is the connection between his questions and to the minister? Well, if the department doesn't lead by example, it could be difficult to influence CN. If the department can't function in French, I don't see how it could influence the CN to function in French. Mr. Beaulieu, I was listening to you, and before the point of order, I was wondering the same thing myself. Unanimously, we decided, all parties wanted to hear from the Minister of Transport to speak to the New Democrats' motion about CN. I'm listening to you. Well, I find that my questions are perfectly relevant. It's a matter of setting the example. But if we want to focus more on CN, I would ask you this. How can you explain that these former crown corporations like Air Canada that have obligations pursuant to the Official Languages Act, why do they keep getting all these complaints year after year? In the 60s, someone said that there were not enough Francophones that were competent enough to sit on these boards, and 50 years later, there still are no Francophones. So we know that the Official Languages Act is not effective. So what do you think you can do? For example, the government of Quebec has Bill 101. Bill 101 can make sure that a business that doesn't have its French certification can have all of its subsidies withdrawn from the government of Quebec. Do you think your department, would you be open to your department doing the same thing? I'm so sorry, Mr. Beaulieu. As much as I stopped the clock during your point of order, you have gone way over your time.
From Mrs. Nikki Ashton. Mrs. Ashton, 6 minutes for you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the minister. My first question is this. We have to start by saying that people in Quebec and throughout Canada are concerned about the decline of French. This is a systemic crisis that Francophones are confronted with. We have multiple failures since you've been in office. We have the CEO of Air Canada who turns his nose up at French, and the Official Languages Commissioner says that your government is responsible for a systemic crisis for French workers. Now, more recently, we've heard about the situation at CN. Instead of protecting French, why is your government leaving Francophones behind?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ms. Ashton. And perhaps this will help me build also on trying to answer Monsieur Beaulieu's question. I do agree that we have to do everything we can to protect French, and that French language is under threat. And therefore, we need to ensure that we address all systemic issues and ensure that there are no obstacles to Canadians to receive service or as an employee to work in a place of the language of their choice. So we will continue to modernize. There's a proposal right now to modernize the Official Languages Act, including offering or providing the Official Languages Commissioner with new tools that includes the imposition of fines when failures occur. So I will continue to do my part personally and do more. We all have to do more. And I stand here humbly asking for more ideas from this committee to what else can we do to ensure that we protect the rights of all Canadians.
Et c'est ça, j'aimerais mettre le focus encore une fois.
I'd like to focus on CN again because this is a matter of security. If rail companies can't have superintendents that speak French in Eastern Canada, for example, this could lead to dangerous situations. There are cases in which we need translators to make maneuvers. This is a security issue. We know that there's an increase of rail accidents over the last few years. It's not enough to talk to us about C-13. We have to act now because we know that this affects security. What are you waiting on before you act? Do we need to have an accident that happens when team members don't understand instructions?
I agree with you about how critical it is that workers are able to work in their language of choice. And these obligations for CN has existed for decades. And CN is expected to ensure that all of its employees and all of its customers are able to work in the language of their choice. So it would be unacceptable for CN not to fulfill that obligation even before C13 passes. And we all need to work together on identifying areas of improvement so we can ensure that not only the Official Languages Act as is today is upheld, but how can we improve it? Because you're right, we do not. First, we have to respect Canadians' rights and ensure that they work in a safe place, but also that they're able to conduct their job properly and adequately and safely. So we have to remain vigilant and work together to ensure that we uphold those responsibilities.
Ma prochaine question, on sait que
My next question is this. We know that laws that protect passengers in Canada are very weak when we compare them to European laws. Passengers are then double penalized after the Michael Rousseau, the CEO of Air Canada's English-only speech. We know that there were 2,680 complaints. It's more than any other files in the history of the Commissioner. The frustration of passengers in Canada is clear, and the Canadian government is not taking it seriously. When are you going to defend Francophone passengers and require Air Canada to respect its language obligations?
Heard these complaints loud and clear, and that's why a significant element of Bill C-13 is creating more powers for the Official Languages Commissioner to impose serious fines against corporations or organizations that fail to uphold their responsibility, including Air Canada. So I can assure you that not only do I and Transport Canada and other government officials keep reminding Air Canada of their responsibility, but now we're providing new tools that there will be severe consequences for any failure of upholding these obligations.
30 secondes, Madame Ashton.
You have 30 seconds, Mrs. Ashton. Thank you. And to close, between Air Canada and CN, it's become obvious that we have big problems with regards to respecting Francophones. And the matter of security is also important. We're talking about C-13, but I'd like to know if you as a minister are ready to take your responsibilities and force these companies to respect their official languages responsibilities because it's part of your responsibility.
Pas le temps pour la réponse, Madame.
We won't have time for the answer, Mrs. Ashton, but maybe the minister will be able to continue on this on the second round. So now we're starting the second round of questions, and this will start with 5 minutes of questioning from Mr. Richard Lehoux. You now have 5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Hello, Mr. Minister. Thank you for your efforts with speaking French. My question is this. Does your colleague, the Minister of Official Languages, has she met with you to discuss measures regarding CN?
I've met on multiple occasions, and we've spoken on multiple occasions, whether it was regarding C-13 or whether it was the CN Board of Directors appointments issue. We have spoken.
Merci pour votre réponse.
Thank you for your answer, Mr. Minister. What specific measures can you talk to us about? We would like some details on what you've done with CN.
Thank you for the question. Immediately after it became, after the appointments were announced and it became clear that there was a shortcomings there, we have spoken with CN and let them know that it was unacceptable. I can't speak on behalf of Minister Paripat-Taylor, but I could tell you that the message was sent loud and clear to CN. They've acknowledged this shortfall, and they've committed that it will be addressed in the next appointment. And I know that CN is coming before this committee, so I'm sure you will be asking them all the questions that you have, and I look forward to that exchange.
Merci, Monsieur le Ministre.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. In the end, this is just a slap on the wrists. you're not using much force. You're not asking for concrete action. Parallel to this, within CN's board of directors, have any measures been taken to ensure a greater French presence within the board of directors? What specific measures have been taken or could be taken?
Look, this is an important question that I know that the committee is looking at. I want to repeat what I said earlier. The Official Languages Act is silent on board of directors makeup. So we need to remember that there is no legal obligation right now for CN to have a certain makeup within its board of directors. Now, the committee is going to look at it, look at C13 and consider what else can be done. However, I still think whether the law remains silent or not on the board of directors, that CN should set an example, should set leadership in demonstrating to its employees, to its customers, that they continue to want to have adequate representation on their board of directors.
Justement, à ce sujet-là, Monsieur le
Yes, Mr. Minister. With CN, and when they decide to recruit outside of Quebec for the new administrative positions, and the next assembly will be in a few days, so what have you done as a department and yourself as a minister, Mr. Alghabra, to react following the situation when the board sends out a memo to everyone to say, well, we're going to look outside of Quebec to find francophones? What's your reaction?
I think in fact, it's more than I think. I know that CN is not confused about our position, about the importance of having a francophone, somebody who's from Quebec on the board of directors. The message was sent loud and clearly to CN, and I know that CN is taking the issue very seriously. And as I said, I look forward to their presentation before you when they come here.
C'est sûr que, Monsieur le Ministre, merci pour vos...
Thank you, Minister. But with C13, we're looking forward for it to be presented so we can bring forth amendments. Some amendments will allow you to have the ability to intervene with different boards, such as that of CN or Air Canada. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So is your intention firm? That is, to take these recommendations and to apply them concretely in the future?
Monsieur le ministre, désolé, Monsieur le ministre.
Sorry, Mr. Minister. Perhaps the minister can continue later on.
Come from Mrs. Patricia Latanzio. À vous, Madame Latanzio, pour 5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you. And I also would like to welcome our minister here today.
Take the opportunity to commend you, Minister, for your efforts in speaking, understanding French, and do know that you are before the best standing committee here. Without further ado, I was just wondering, I understand it's very clear from your testimony today that the official languages is silent with regards to the makeup of the board of directors. But could you tell us what criteria the CN looks at in selecting its board members? Do you have any idea? Can you enlighten us on this topic?
Thank you for this question. CN is a private corporation, and they get to decide the type of skills and backgrounds that their board members need to have. I suspect that is a dynamic thing depending on the challenges or the opportunities that they see they need to be filled within their board of directors. So they do not run the qualification or the type of individuals they're looking for by me or by Transport Canada.
Okay, so if it's based on skill set And we know that you are setting the example because you are saying quite clearly here today that you would like CN and Air Canada to be the leaders, to be the wave that leadership flag with regards to, making sure that there is a Francophone representation on its board of directors. That being said, would you not agree that if there would be a skilled individual, that French could also be learned?
I think one's ability to speak official languages, French or English, should be part of the skills that any board of directors or any corporation is looking for. I think it's really important that CN has adequate representation, not only a Francophone adequate representation, but to have representation from Quebec. I think those are part of the set of skills that are needed to be present on the board of directors for CN.
Okay. And how many director positions exist right now at CN, to your knowledge?
Again, at the risk of speaking on behalf of CN, but my knowledge is that they have 11 members right now. I think their articles of corporation allow up to 20, but currently they only have 11.
Okay. So there would be room for 9 more appointed individuals, is what you're telling us.
It's something
if there's need. I understand it's a private corporation, but it's up to 20.
That's what their articles allow for, but it's up to them to decide the size. It's minimum of 7, maximum of 20, but right now they've chosen to have 11.
Okay. Let's shift gears now and speak a little bit about the language commissioner. So are you aware?
I've been corrected. It's 21, up to 21. I apologize.
21. There's one more spot on that board. Thank you. So let's shift gears now. Let's go on and speak a little bit about the official languages commissioner. So are you aware that if the official language commissioner has previously investigated CN for compliance with the Act?
Yes, I actually looked into this before this committee presence, and I found that the Commissioner of Official Languages has received 5 complaints against CN. All of these were received in 2019-20 in relation to Part 5 of the Official Languages Act, which is the language of work.
So I'm sorry, Minister, you're saying ever since 2019 or only in 2019 they received 5?
Over the past 5 years, only received 5 complaints in the year 2019-20.
Okay.
Between 2019 and 2020.
Okay, they've received 5.
Yes.
Okay, on Part 5 of the law. Okay. And what were the circumstances and conclusions of those complaints?
25 secondes.
Okay, so it is under Part 5, which is the language of work. So those are internal matters. Typically, the commissioner does not make the findings public to protect the privacy of the complainant, to ensure that the complainant's issues remain private. So I don't know the outcome because the commissioner never releases these investigations.
Merci, Monsieur le Ministre. Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. 2.5 minutes. Mr. Beaulieu. We came back to this issue of Francophones on the boards, and there's a Teamster union, and they are bringing up different issues, and they're talking about safety issues as well. If you give important instructions and someone doesn't completely understand, this could be dangerous. So do you have somebody who can intervene in cases of workplace safety?
Look, I agree about the importance of the ability of workers to work in their language of choice, and it has a safety ramification. CN, if we're talking here about CN, has an obligation to ensure all of their workers are able to work their language of choice. And if they are not upholding that responsibility, the Official Languages Act, a commissioner is able to investigate and hold them accountable for potential failure. It's to your point, I just want to reiterate this. Safety is at stake. Not only rights are at stake, but safety is at stake, and the CN must fulfill its obligation.
C'est bon. Puis une chose, parce que, bon, comme sont toutes...
CN is subject to the Official Languages Act. So contrary to other private enterprises, such as Air Canada, because as you said, these are former Crown corporations, and when they were privatized, they did make commitments, and we see that things aren't working. Oftentimes, the Official Languages Act is based on bilingualism, individual and institutional bilingualism to allow individuals a freedom of choice with regards to their languages. But when you say people can use the language that they would like to use, if I want to work in English, and someone else wants to work in French, well, how does this work? It doesn't work. The principle doesn't work. We need to have a common language somewhere, and this is why Bill 101 seeks to establish French as a common language. And so we've seen for 50 years the Official Languages Act hasn't worked. Why are we continuing to say, oh, yes, it's going to work better this time, when the very principle of the Official Languages Act doesn't work? So why not allow Quebec, for example, apply Bill 101 to these
Vraiment rapidement.
2.5 minutes. So that's all the time we have.
Mr. Chair.
Vous pourrez le faire.
You can respond if somebody asks you the question, but we have to give everyone the chance.
Ashton, for 2 minutes, 30 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We've heard today about how both Air Canada and CN, and now privatized, are not living up to their obligations when it comes to respecting the rights of Francophones, their responsibilities when it comes to services in French. And we're very concerned by the government's most recent proposal, seeking private proposals to cover service for Via Rail's high-frequency corridor. Unifor, who represents more than 2,000 workers at Via, were clear in their opposition, saying public-private partnerships cost more, don't work, and the facts speak for themselves. Privatization in transport means higher cost, broken promises, worse service, and route closures. And perhaps we could add, will impact service in French. Yet this is a strategy your government is using time and time again. We've seen this with the Infrastructure Bank. We are trying to fix that through our bill, my bill, C-245, investing in Indigenous and Northern communities in terms of the climate crisis. But why is your government continuing to rely on bad economic policies that privilege the ultra-wealthy, push privatization, and ultimately impact negatively on service and service delivery in French?
Mrs. Chair and Ms. Ashton, while today we're talking about some of the shortcomings of some former Crown corporations or areas for improvement for our Official Language Act, I think it's really important as well to take stock in the fact that Canada and Canadians have been working really hard together to protect French and to ensure that our cultural identity remains as diverse and as rich as we've always accustomed to it. So I think it's really important to identify what else can we do to improve on our Official Languages Act, but we should also recognize that we've done a lot of good, and we will continue to do more to ensure that we protect people's rights. And as far as the high-frequency rail, this is a great project for rail workers, for travelers. We're going to deliver the largest project in Canada's history that offers to revolutionize the corridor, and I'm looking forward to your support on ensuring that we do it right and we do deliver it on behalf of Canadians. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Merci. Thanks, Minister. Madame Ashton, only 3 seconds left. So, nous allons poursuivre avec 2 questions, Monsieur Généreux et Madame.
Mr. Généreux and Mrs. Kayabaga, 1 minute each. Oh, rather, 4 minutes each. Mr. Généreux, 4 minutes. Thank you. Wow, finally. Hello, Mr. Minister, thank you for being here. I'm a little bit disappointed because you don't have solutions other than C-13 that we will study shortly. And the bill foresees potential fines of $25,000, but $25,000 for CN with billions in business. I don't think a $25,000 fine is going to make them do anything. And I'd like to hear you speak to this. The commissioner would be able to order these businesses to do something. Do you agree with this?
Mr. Chair and Mr. General, CN has already a legal obligation. They are obligated by law. What C13 is proposing is additional tools to enforce the law.
Si je comprends bien,
So if they already are required by law, why don't they do it? I mean, let's also be clear for CN. Let's be fair. They had appointed Mr. Charest, but Mr. Charest left to do something else for the moment. But I would have names to submit, and I could send them 100 resumes of Quebecers with a lot of experience. And maybe Lawrence Cannon, that you know, he's a former Minister of Transportation, former ambassador in Paris, and he would, as you know, you might be, when you retire from politics, able to take a role on a board because you will have the required experience. There are hundreds of people like that in Quebec. They speak French. They're perfectly bilingual, and they would be able to occupy a role such as that, even such as on the CN board. So I have the impression that no one made an effort. The reality is that the government of Canada can't do anything, honestly, unless or they can suggest, and then they can be disappointed if CN doesn't act.
Make a distinction between CN's obligation under the law and the makeup of the board. And you've heard me here today speak very clearly in opposition to how CN appointed its board of members from a leadership standpoint, but the law is silent on this issue. So having said that, we today are learning from that shortcoming, and there's an ongoing discussion about CN's responsibility. CN has acknowledged that this should not have happened. I'm looking forward to the committee's study on this and the report on this. But again, I'm not going to shy away from doing everything I can to defend the interest and the rights of Quebecers to speak and work and receive service in the language of their choice. And I will encourage CN not only to uphold the law, its obligation under the law, but to go beyond that to ensure that they are promoting and protecting the rights of French and those who work at CN.
J'ai d'autres noms à vous
30 secondes.
Comment?
What? 30 seconds? It goes too fast. Mr. Minister, if you had the opportunity, is there a direct link between your department and your position as minister and the nomination of people? Is there a political link? Do you make recommendations to the CN board to appoint people in particular?
No. CN is a private corporation, and they get to make their business decisions on their own. However, we at Transport Canada have a responsibility to ensure that they are upholding the highest safety rules and that they are meeting their...
Thanks, Minister. I have to cut you there because there's another 4 minutes from our colleague, Mrs. Ariel Kayabaga. À vous, Madame Kayabaga, pour 4 minutes.
Mrs. Kayabaga, 4 minutes. Thank you. I'd like to begin by thanking the Minister for being here. Mr. Minister,
comment to Monsieur Beaulieu. I think I'll allow you to start there, as I think he deserves to hear that answer. Yeah.
Thank you, Ms. Kayabaga. The question about uniform language, I understand the point that you're making. However, I also want to remind everyone, as we are talking about the importance of safety and ability of workers to work so they can do their job properly, we also need to respect the rights of individuals who may not be able to speak French so they can do their job safely and adequately. So we want to protect both the rights of both languages. Obviously, we want to protect... French is under significant type of threat than English. I recognize that. But when it comes to also safety, we want to make sure that those who don't speak French are able to conduct their job safely. But we will do everything we can to ensure that CN upholds its responsibility towards its workers, towards its customers, when it comes to the French language.
Merci, Monsieur le Ministre. Et puis, à quelle fréquence les postes de directeur deviennent-ils
Thank you. How often do director positions become available? What's the term of the mandate?
Again, at the risk of answering on behalf of CN, but I'll share with you my knowledge, and I know you're going to speak with CN. My understanding is that each term is a one-year term. It's renewable, but it happens to be a one-year term.
Okay. And à votre avis, comment est-ce que la loi
In your opinion, how would C13 change the way that businesses such as CN approach the French language, and what advantage could this have on francophones throughout Canada?
C13 builds on our government's commitment to protect the French language, to ensure that francophones are supported whenever they want to work in the workplace, ensuring that they use their language of choice, and it gives additional powers and authorities to the official language commissioner to impose significant fines to make sure that it's not only just made public, but it's also imposed, and there are financial ramifications to such infraction.
Merci. Puis pensez.
1 minute. 1 minute. Let's talk about Air Canada and CN. How do they compare with regards to the Act? And do you think their current state represents where we want such large corporations to go? Are they how we want them to be for francophones in Quebec and outside of Quebec?
I think it's thank you for the question. I think it's important to note the difference between Air Canada and CN in that Air Canada has a customer-facing interaction with its passengers, with millions of passengers, while CN deals with business customers and obviously has a lot of workers. So does Air Canada. But there's a difference in the nature of their business, and that's why there's additional emphasis, as we've been said earlier before, on Air Canada and the complaints that Air Canada receives. But I think both need to continue to uphold their obligation under the Official Languages Act. I see Mr. Chair is...
Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Minister. Yeah, it seems cruel, but I have to do that. But Minister Alghabra, as we say to our witnesses that came in the past year, if you have anything else that you think should be shared with our committee, please just provide our clerk a written addendum to today's testimony, and she'll share that to all members. So thank you, Minister of Transport. It was a pleasure and an honor for us to get to have you with us, and as well to your officials for being here today. So, ceci étant dit...
That being said, the meeting is now adjourned. See you next Wednesday.
Au revoir.